Welcome to Ground Rules, Employment Law over your coffee break. My name's Pam Howland, and I'm here today with Jennifer Walrath and Doug Plass, and we're rolling into the holiday season, thinking about office holiday parties and the types of issues that employers should proactively be thinking about when it comes to employment law compliance issues that have a tendency to creep into holiday parties. So we've been noodling through this a little bit, and a few of the bigger buckets of things that we're going to talk about today that you may have already thought of, or maybe it hadn't really crossed your mind, are issues like the big one that I think is kind of obvious is alcohol and maybe the risk of harassment claims. That's one issue that's probably not too surprising for anyone, but we're going to revisit that one a little bit. Talking a little bit about, maybe respect and civility and how people drink, the walls come down, and if maybe there's already some type of conflict brewing in the workplace, that office party just might unleash something a little bit bigger. So thinking through respect and civility in a climate where we know that's been more challenging than ever for employers in 2025. Going to talk about a few issues maybe you hadn't thought of, like some wage and hour liability, maybe some workers' comp liability. So Merry Christmas with that in mind. Like, you can't have a party without thinking through these things. But it's our job as your compliance, acquaintances, colleagues to flag these things for you, because there are definitely some best practices and some proactive things that you can put into place to minimize your liability. And as always, to make sure you don't do something that's going to land you in a claim or a lawsuit. So let's take on harassment. Let's talk a little bit about alcohol and the possibility of sexual harassment claims in regard to Christmas or holiday parties.
Yeah, I hope it's not surprising to people listening that if some incident did occur during a work-hosted holiday party, that is something that the employer can be liable for. So, as always, you should have an anti-harassment, anti-discrimination policy, right? Have your people trained on what these things are. And if something does happen, that someone files a report or a complaint after a holiday party, you'll want to act accordingly. Now, that doesn't really address the alcohol piece of things, right? But, I think what I would say is, kind of treating that holiday party as no different than any other workplace situation in terms of expecting people to behave in accordance with your policies. And if they don't, then you have to act accordingly to discipline if appropriate. You might even have to investigate and do all the things that you would normally do if someone were to file a report of harassment.
And it might be a good idea to remind your employees of those policies right before the holiday party. Say, this is a work event and you're expected to behave in a professional manner, and all of our policies will be in effect at this event, or something to that effect.
And we see these kinds of claims. We see these come through our door. So it does happen.
Yeah. And I think some employers operate under the mistaken understanding that if it's off-site, if it's off hours, maybe even if it's not mandatory, that somehow would put them, alleviate any kind of liability for some type of inappropriate conduct. And we know that's not the case. If you've been tuning in to other podcasts, in fact, you know that in 2024, the EEOC came out with some updated harassment guidance. I think that it's a good time to think about that a little bit, which talked about harassment in the world we're living in now, because there hadn't been any guidance for multiple decades, and really focused on how off-duty types of conduct can result in liability for employers. So, that focus was on more like things like social media and posts that maybe occur off hours at home. But the same concepts apply here, in the sense that if you're having a holiday party hosted by your company, you're certainly not off the hook for whatever happens there just because it's not on your premises and because it might be during different hours than when you normally have workplace functions take place. So it's a good reminder, maybe a good time for some training even, right? You might be running out of time. So you might need to add that to the list for 2026. But make sure you're caught up on what can lead to harassment claims in the world we're living in right now.
Yeah, and we were kind of talking before we started, if you're an employer and you're like, well, but I still want to have a holiday party. I want my people to, kind of gather together, maybe with significant others and have a nice time and, kind of foster that kind of team atmosphere and things like that. What can I do to maybe lessen the risk that something happens that leads to liability? And we were kicking around sort of how do you kind of just address the fact there is alcohol at the event and people will be partaking. Maybe having it provided by an official server of some kind, like a caterer, was one of Doug's suggestions, right? So this person who is, trained to serve people and, kind of monitor whether or not there needs to be a stopping service for certain people, serving the right amounts, things like that, right? Having things like drink tickets to maybe minimize the total number of drinks that people are going to have, things like that. I think we had a couple other ideas.
Yeah, other things like, consider whether or not hard liquor is something you want to be involved with. If you just serve beer and wine, you're less likely to have as big of a problem because people just can't drink quite as quickly. That's one thing.
And maybe have a set number of hours for your event. We were talking about, don't necessarily have some all day affair or a half day multiple events, pick a couple hours at the location for the event. And maybe even sort of shut down the service of the alcohol a certain amount of time before the actual event ends, just so that people are, kind of slowing down consumption toward the end. Having food and water, all these things are ways that you can sort of help to mitigate and make it less likely that someone will overconsume and behave poorly.
Yeah. And your crowd, right? I mean, I think that's an important consideration. All workplaces, the composition. What was really coming to my mind when Doug was talking about, are you really going to serve hard alcohol, is a wedding I went to last summer where every function was open bar, right? Where the host was paying for everything. So, I mean, there was a group of people there who were out to, get the advantage, maximize their time. And there were people going up to the bar getting shot after shot after shot because there were no parameters on what was going to be covered. And let's just say at the time they cut the cake, one of those people doing that walked by and literally vomited all over the tent. It was at this beautiful outdoor venue. Oh my God. It was crazy.
Things you don't want to have happen at your company party or your wedding.
Things you do not want to have happen at your or your wedding. We got Haley Apple over here who's planning your wedding. That's a wedding tip. Be careful about the open bar. But I do that is a good idea. Do you want to have hard liquor at all on the table? And just put some parameters in if you feel like that crowd might need it. I like the drink ticket idea, and have limited hours. This event's going from 6 to 8 p.m. We were talking a little bit here about some situations we've encountered with clients where they have the holiday party and then the after party. And it seems like the claims kind of creep up maybe more in the after party scenario. Not like you're ever going to be able to stop that. People, who decide to go out and do their own thing after. But again, as the employer, maybe you want to make it clear that the employer sanctioned part of that party is for several hours, and here are the parameters that go along with that. I like that.
And if you have your managers and supervisors going to the after party, gosh, Pretty hard to say that's not a company event.
Yeah. So another issue that we were talking about is this world we're living in with employers really struggling with culture and disrespect and political conflict, and maybe employees not getting along, maybe employees following each other on social media and not liking the types of posts that some people are putting up because they're not aligned with someone else's values. The whole alcohol piece certainly may take some walls down that might embolden someone to approach a coworker about a topic that's been brewing. So again, more reasons than ever right now to really think carefully through the alcohol piece and what you're going to do to kind of have a few guardrails on that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we did want to mention before I forget is, we always encourage employers to have a drug and alcohol policy. It's sort of one of those policies in the handbook that's a must-have in our view. And sometimes those policies will say, never shalt thou drink alcohol, kind of while on company time, right? It's like a complete ban to alcohol at work. So just be aware, if you do host a holiday party, you may have to tweak that policy a little bit just to allow for the fact that if the employer is hosting the event, it is acceptable, but not at other times. But, get the language in there that makes it so it's acceptable under your own policies to be having the event in the first place.
Yeah, to really encourage responsible drinking. It's, again, a lot of employers have business development type requirements where employees, the reality is they are going to be going to events occasionally and having drinks. So you don't want a total ban on anything related to alcohol if your employees are going to be violating it just by nature of the fact that they're trying to meet your expectations. One thing you don't want as an employer is a handbook where your policies aren't followed or they don't really fit the facts in your workplace. Maybe one more reason, not to get that AI generated handbook, because there's a lot of things that you got to tweak to your own workplace requirements and the realities of what your employees do and don't do just to meet your goals and expectations. I was thinking too, there have been some studies and some guidance over the years from the EEOC. And I was thinking about, do you guys remember that Uber case that was it's probably been close to 10 years ago now, but where sexual harassment was pervasive there and it triggered this big investigation and a whole bunch of fallout, like basically almost all of the leadership team was terminated. And one of the key components of that was a conclusion that alcohol was encouraged in excess, even on a day-to-day basis in the workplace. And there's been some EEOC guidance from that. And from other types of studies the EEOC has done, just really maybe stating the obvious, which is that if you have a workplace where excessive drinking is happening, you're going to be more susceptible to claims of harassment and discrimination. So something else to think about there. Jennifer's discussion about policies you should be thinking about, maybe in your code of conduct, you have a responsible drinking, prong to that is something that's required. And that if employees are going to show up wasted to your company sponsored events, there could be some type of disciplinary action, maybe making that clear if that's something you're worried about. So Doug had some ideas on wage and hour possible liability, and maybe you've thought of this, maybe you haven't, but it might be worth bouncing around wage and hour issues a little bit here too.
Yeah, so employees need to consider whether or not this is a voluntary or a mandatory event. And if it is in fact a mandatory event, you're going to want to pay your employees for attending. And if it's a voluntary event, you need to communicate that. If you're holding it in the office during the workday, it's kind of hard to say that it's voluntary. But another issue that most people might not consider is that if you're giving out gifts and bonuses at this event, make sure you communicate to your employees that they don't have to actually attend to get them if this is a voluntary party. Because if you do require them to attend in order to get some benefit for the job, you're going to want to pay them for that as well.
Yeah. So happy holidays. There's your wage an hour idea related to the holiday party.
Yeah. I was just thinking maybe another reason, if you have it after hours, to keep it to a reasonable amount of time, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And defined, right? So that people really know what is the expectation there.
And then also, a lot of times there will be some employees whose job it is to facilitate and coordinate the party. So think about that, right? Those people may, if it's voluntary for everybody else, might not be voluntary for them, or they may have some time associated with planning that's out of work time that you may need to compensate for them. So it's really just be mindful of this and communicative as to what your expectations are.
Yeah, and then the last one we were brainstorming a little bit was possible workers' comp liability too. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I mean, and kind of the theme of this whole thing, I think, is, if people are drinking alcohol, sometimes that leads to maybe not as great a decision making as you normally would exhibit, or things like lack of good balance, right? I mean, it just really does make it more possible that someone could have an injury. If it's on the job while you're at work, might have some workers' compensation liability kicking in, and regardless, there could be some kind of like even a tort claim, like for negligence or something. I mean, that's not quite our specialty here at Idaho Employment Lawyers, but I think just one more reason to be thinking about all these things in advance and taking steps to just mitigate the likelihood that consumption of alcohol at the event could cause mischief.
Yeah, so maybe offering free rideshare services to folks after the event. I mean, usually we think when something's over, maybe the liability ends. But what happens if, somebody is giving another employee a ride home and they themselves are inebriated or something that,
get in an accident or something.
Yeah, or not. Yeah. So these are all things to think about.
Yeah. Yep. So I still think probably the biggest issue that we've seen with holiday parties falls into that harassment bucket. So again, as you're thinking through closing out 2025, 2026, might be a little late for you to get training, policies, all that stuff, but it's a good time to be thinking about it for 2026. So, think about, do your supervisors, do your employees know and understand laws related to harassment and discrimination? Because those type of things could apply both to things they're doing on-site and off-site on behalf of your company. And do you have the right policies in place, in light of changes we've seen this year? I think, some years when we're talking about closing the year out and updating your handbook, I might be thinking, it doesn't seem like there's been a lot of change, but this year there certainly has been. I think there's no lack of issues stirring around out there, and it's a good time to pull out your handbook, think about it, and get it revised for the new year. So, Doug?
Yeah, I have one more thought. That's something that didn't make it on our list and probably should have. So I'd be remiss for not mentioning it. And that has to do with religious discrimination, holiday parties. So if your holiday party is overtly religious in any way, or, you have a particularly diverse workforce, like you might want to think about, how to make everybody feel welcome and feel like they're not being subjected to some religious views that they don't subscribe to.
That also might affect your choice of scheduling the holiday party, right? Like if people observe Sabbath on a given day of the week, you might need to think about the timing of when the event is if you want to encourage or allow, people to have the opportunity to attend.
Yeah. Great point. We know that in 2025, religious discrimination issues are a focus of the EEOC. So important to be thinking about that too. The whole accommodation issue, law has changed somewhat over the past several years, and employees are now, possibly entitled to accommodations that may not have been on the table 5 years ago in light of some new U.S. Supreme Court law. So again, training, make sure you know and understand that. Make sure you know and understand what I was just talking about with religious accommodation. And if that sounds like something that you're not aware of, might be time to look that one up and get a little bit more training. Okay, we think that covers it. So above all, we hope you have a very happy holiday. We hope if you're having a holiday party, it goes very smoothly and everyone has a great time and appreciates it. And that's it for today on Ground Rules. We'll see you next time. Ground Rules hosts and guests are not providing legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction.